Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for our Massachusetts Transportation Electrification Advocacy webinar, which is a mouthful. My name is Anna, and I am the Electric Vehicle Program Director at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization with a mission to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low-carbon future. That's a lot of syllables, and what it basically means is that we run a series of consumer-facing programs that help people make smart choices on energy for their lives and also environmentally. And then we take the experience that we gain interacting with folks on that level to influence the advocacy work that we do at the state level. So we're here today to talk about transportation because it's National Drive Electric Week, which is everybody's favorite week of the year. And because we have been running a program called Drive Green for almost 4 years now that helps make electric vehicles more affordable and accessible for folks. So in a moment, I'll ask my esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, but I wanted to quickly cover a couple of logistics first. So all participants are muted, but this is a panel, so we want to hear from you. So please submit your questions into the chat feature that you should see right on your GoToWebinar panel. The first part of the conversation will be based on the questions that a lot of you pre-submitted when you registered, but after that, I'll turn to the questions and make sure we can get as many of them answered as possible. Finally, I just want to set some objectives for this webinar. My hope is that at the end of this webinar, you'll walk away with a more full understanding about why transportation electrification is so important. You'll have a better sense of what is going on right now at the state, and you'll have one thing that you can do to engage in this important conversation moving forward. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves with their name, their organization, and what their top transportation electrification priority is. Right now, we're in the next 6 months. One note is that Eugenia Gibbons, formerly of Green Energy Consumers Alliance and now with Healthcare Without Harm, had a last-minute conflict come up, so she won't be able to join us, but we will have an excellent conversation nonetheless. So Dan, if you don't mind starting us off.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. And really want to highlight what a great job the Drive Green program is doing right now in terms of making electric vehicle purchases simpler and easier for people. It's something that's very important to us and to our administration. The Baker administration supports the transition to electric vehicles. In the Future of Transportation report that we released last year, we committed the state to the goal of 100% passenger vehicle sales of electric vehicles by 2040. Really great to see the state of California showing their leadership on this question last week as well. And so we're really excited. I will say I'm particularly excited right now about the prospects of working with California to think about what the long-term transition trajectory looks like. But I guess I'll say, as a driver of an electric vehicle myself, it's super exciting that these vehicles are here, that they're great cars, and it's great to be part of making this transition happen. So thanks, everybody, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dan. Dina, go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and a happy National Drive Electric Week. I'm Veena Dharmaraj, the Director of Transportation at the Massachusetts Sierra Club. I lead efforts to accelerate the electrification of transit fleets and the adoption of electric vehicles through policy advocacy, public outreach, and coalition building. As all of you on this call, I'm sure, know that transportation is the top source for air as well as climate pollution in Massachusetts, and it disproportionately impacts communities of color. Studies have highlighted that people with long-term exposure to air pollution are at 15% greater risk to die from air pollution-related health impacts as compared to those who live in less polluted areas. And electrification of both our public as well as private fleets can be a part of the solution, together with improving access to public transit as well as making it safer for people to walk and bike. And definitely my top transportation priority is electrification of both our transit fleets as well as our state fleets. And I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussing this further. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Veena. And Kevin, round us out.
Hi, I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the Director of Public Policy for ChargePoint, which is the largest EV charging network. We build, design, and manufacture electric vehicle charging stations and provide solutions for independent owners and operators to run those stations and offer charging services. We make charging solutions for wherever someone needs to plug in, at home, work, around town, or on the go. Our company is based in Silicon Valley, California, but all of our stations are locally owned and operated. So the chargers that are right outside of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs on Cambridge Street are owned by the City of Boston. And we had some in my neighborhood when I used to live in right outside Union Square in Somerville. So I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. All the problems that we face locally and nationally can be solved though locally. And so we've got a great group of folks to chat about these issues, and looking forward to some of the great questions that the participants have as well.
Wonderful. So Veena took a lot of words out of my mouth with your framing of the question. And before we jump into the conversation, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One is that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, the largest sector, but it's also a huge source of other pollutants that are really causing a lot of harm in communities across the Commonwealth. And as we all know, everybody's thinking about air quality and lung health right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I really want to stress that is one of the reasons why we support electrifying transportation. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, yes, we are big fans of biking and walking and public transit, but for this webinar, we're really going to focus on electrifying transportation, which obviously overlaps with some of those other topics, but I wanted to preempt any questions about what about bike paths. Yes, we need bike paths for sure. So as a first sort of question, I was wondering, Dan, if you could give us a quick update on the main state policies that we have around electrifying transportation and what might be coming down the line.
Sure, thanks. And Kevin, I really look forward to seeing that charging station if I ever make it into the EEA office. I transitioned in April, so I haven't actually been inside my office yet. But you know, I think coming and making this job transition into state government, you know, during this COVID crisis, obviously, you know, puts the question of air quality right front and center for myself and for my whole agency, and especially, you know, thinking about air quality in those communities that we know are getting hit worst with COVID, and the communities that we knew even before COVID were getting hit worst with air pollution coming from our vehicles. So, you know, for me coming into this role, one of my first priorities was to make sure that we have an incentive program to be able to address electrification of heavy duty, medium and heavy duty vehicles. We see this as a really important air quality goal. These are the heaviest emitters on the road. I think in particular, when you think about medium duty step vans, so your UPS trucks, your Amazon trucks, your DHL trucks, all those trucks that are doing the last mile delivery services, those are the diesel vehicles that actually enter into residential neighborhoods, right? You know, tractor trailers tend to stay on the highways and go to the warehouses, but you know, when it comes to diesel vehicles in residential neighborhoods, it's really those last mile delivery trucks. And the good news about those is that their duty cycle is actually quite consistent with electrification, and the vehicles in that medium duty category are absolutely here and coming in greater numbers over the next few years. In Europe, we're already seeing pretty significant market penetration of electric delivery trucks. So that's been, you know, I think a big priority for the state, and we'll have more to announce on that at our next commission meeting on October 13th, which is a public meeting you're all invited to. In addition to that, of course, we're thinking about the state's main rebate program, MOR EV, which provides incentives for the purchase of battery electric vehicles, $2,500 right now, or $1,500 for a plug-in hybrid. Right now, we're thinking about a couple of ways that we might modify that program, both to try to make the vehicle incentives available to the consumer right at the point of sale. That's something that we're looking at how to do right now, and then we're also thinking about, how do we better target low, medium income consumers and really make it more affordable for them and kind of break electric vehicles out of the high income level and kind of reach to the rest of us. So those are some of our top priorities. In addition, we're very much thinking about how building out our charging infrastructure is going to work, and I can talk more about that later. But yeah, that's some of the things that we're doing.
Wonderful. I have one question that I'm actually going to bounce to Kevin real quick. We at Green Energy Consumers really appreciate the shifting focus to medium and heavy duty vehicles, because those are really the biggest criminals in the public health front. And I'm wondering how ChargePoint, as one of the charging providers, I hope that's the right term, is thinking about medium and heavy duty vehicles in the next couple of years.
That's a great question. The fleetification of transportation really highlights the need to address all classes of vehicles. Medium and heavy duty vehicles, as Dan was speaking to and as you're highlighting on it, really need to be front and center. And they already are for our team. And so we have several teams within ChargePoint that are looking at how do we provide support for transit fleets, and how do we differentiate the types of support and consideration that need to be given to other types of vehicle fleets, from light, medium to heavy duty. One of the things that is interesting is getting policymakers and getting even the industry to think beyond just, well, what's the barrier to deploying and installing a charging station? Massachusetts already has a really great foundation for dealing with the upfront capital challenges associated with helping fleets electrify. Right? We have great programs through Eversource and National Grid, our utilities, to support the installation of charging stations. We have fantastic opportunities through Mass DEP and through other state agencies to figure out how do we create appropriately sized incentives for the equipment itself. But one of the challenges for this really unique set of consumers, right? A fleet operator is the closest thing in real life that we get to a rational economic actor. You, me, everyone else, we make decisions based on emotional, like that car is cool, I want to take that one on a road trip. And those are important for mass market adoption, but for a fleet operator, they need to be able to pencil things out, right? And the challenge here is, well, how do we make sure that we've got the regulatory environment in place to have sustainable long-term transition to electric drive? So electricity prices are much more stable than gasoline prices. That part's easy. The challenge is that we haven't seen technologies like this really adopted at scale. So the way that the electricity rates themselves are structured completely ignore the reality of what a fleet operator needs to support an electric fleet. So what's a really exciting opportunity right before Massachusetts, first state in the nation to get this close to just having an approach where the state says, this is a problem and we need to solve it. So 16 different entities, from ChargePoint to Green Energy Consumers Alliance to the Sierra Club, have all signed a letter supporting passing a law that would require utilities to just start to address the problem. We're not saying how to fix the problem, it's just we acknowledge that this is an issue, we need to solve it. And by having a sustainable framework in place, that creates the predictability that medium and heavy duty fleet operators need from the private sector to the T. If they don't have that in place, they can't predict what the costs will be. This puts a huge amount of burden, and I get into the weeds on this. I used to be the CFO for EEA. I love getting into these weeds, but suffice it to say, the House and the Senate are right now deliberating what should be in the transportation bond bill, what should be in our long-term transportation infrastructure investments. And if you don't think about what the operating costs are and how we can make that predictable, none of those upfront capital investments to create clean transportation solutions are going to amount to a hill of beans. So I just want to emphasize that we think about this every day, and Massachusetts is really in a pole position to make this a sustainable, scalable, rapidly electrified transportation future.
Wonderful. I have one quick follow-up, and then I'll turn to Vina to talk about the transit piece a little bit more. I know that National Grid is pursuing a pilot to study co-locating storage and solar panels at DC fast charging locations. The idea being that rather than being hit by a demand charge, when you pull from the grid, you can pull from the battery that you've filled up with your solar panels, and that mitigates the costs a little bit. And I'm wondering what your perspective is on the potential for that to really take hold in Massachusetts.
That's a great question, and and look, we're extremely supportive of any and all opportunity to make transportation even cleaner. Right? We partner with an entity that creates a mobile portable solar canopy, and they integrate our charging solutions into that. So, you know, if we can avoid having a grid-tied piece of equipment, all the better. I think one of the challenges when you get to trying to solve the problem about electricity rates, about this operating cost, by saying, well, we'll just deploy storage, is then you have to start thinking about, well, how does that make the deployment itself that much more expensive and difficult for a transit fleet to deal with? So, you know, the same pieces that are in play for making the cost of batteries for vehicles cheaper over time, it's also in play for stationary storage. So over time, that could be definitely part of a solution. And we're really supportive of all these pilots. But what we want to do is not create a situation where we're relying on ratepayers to subsidize this over time, right? If we make a predictable investment environment that lets public and private entities start to dive in and really take advantage of this. But it'll all be part of the same solution. We're already trying to pursue these pieces, and look, the more the merrier. Let's make this cleaner. But at the end of the day, a battery solution won't fully charge everything that we need. Like, it's not going to be able to complete that route. And we want those vehicles to be on the road, to be able to complete their route, so that folks can, you know, have Ride Electric Week, not just Drive Electric Week.
I have one clarifying question on the audience, which is there's some confusion about your statement that electricity prices are stable and that they are unpredictable for these fleet managers. So I'm wondering if you could explain the issue of demand charges versus kilowatt per kilowatt hour charges.
Sure, that's a fair clarification. I tried to skirt the issue, but someone asked, so now we're going to go into it. And so, you know, don't say that you weren't warned. So when it comes to the differences between what's on your residential electricity bill and what's on a commercial and industrial entity's electricity bill, your home electricity bill, you pretty much just get charged for how much energy you consume. A commercial and industrial ratepayer also gets charged for that. So that's the kilowatt hour component. That's for, let's say, how much water is flowing through the pipe. But the commercial and industrial ratepayer also gets charged for how wide that pipe is, for how much demand they could impose on the system. So on their electricity bill, they'll typically see a charge for how much is consumed in kilowatt hours, and then for how much demand they could at any given time impose on the grid, which is factored in terms of kilowatts. And the highest kilowatt meter reading that they take in a 15-minute period for an entire month is what you get whacked for. So this makes sense if you're a factory that's on for 12 to 14 hours a day. That's predictably going to have a certain impact on the electricity system, and it's going to have an impact on the total system peak. And so what that's doing is saying, if you're going to be adding to that system peak, and you're going to be adding to the need to create more generation assets to meet that need, you should get charged for a certain amount. But DC fast charging stations have very low utilization, right? So right now, usually between 0.5 and maybe 1.5 sessions per day in a good location. Things are a little bit more challenging when you think about fleets, because their utilization is driven solely by how do I keep my fleet on the road, and each fleet is going to have a different duty cycle. So there isn't that same predictability for the utility. So it's like you're applying a mathematical equation from one school of thought to one that totally doesn't apply here, and you're saying, well, it's a mathematical equation, so it has to work, but we're doing different math, right? I can't use my algebra, my basic algebra, to solve calculus. Like, yes, they're numbers, but they're not the right numbers. And so we're just saying, when you make that calculation, what would be helpful would be, what let's think about what are the right numbers we have to use here. States around the country have started to look at this. There are great examples of rates that accurately reflect the cost to serve DC fast charging stations without if you don't do that, it effectively penalizes someone for having low utilization, even though they're not adding to some of those peaks. So that's the more complicated question, and I could go into it in even more complexity. The things that I'll leave you with is I'm happy to do that offline with folks, but the simple thing you can do would be to make sure that the House and the Senate Conference Committee for the Transportation Bond Bill know that there's widespread support, that this isn't just some advocacy groups and some private companies that are saying you should do this. This is people who want to make sure that we have investments that are taking place to increase access to charging, right? No matter who you are, where you are in the Commonwealth.
And just to underscore, or maybe to summarize there, I think the practical upshot of everything that Kevin is talking about is that DC fast chargers right now, we don't really have a financially sustainable model for constructing DC fast chargers, and that's something that is really important, and we're going to need to be able to figure out, and we're going to need to be able to work with the DPU, with the legislature, with everybody to be able to figure out how we make DC fast charging, what that financially sustainable model is.
Well, thank you for that
level 2 charge
introduction.
Great. That's where you're going to get the majority of your charge as an owner is going to come from overnight level 2, and that's really cheap. It's like $1.30 for gasoline. So but the DC fast charging piece is definitely a piece that we need to figure out.
Yeah, don't let this scare you away. If you're not currently an EV driver, it's fine. It's just a question of whether you want to install like 3 megawatts worth of DC fast charging to electrify an entire 30 to 60 vehicle fleet. Then you have to start thinking about this piece. But I totally agree with Dan. Otherwise.
So shifting us slightly out of the weeds of rate design, which is an important conversation to have. Veena, I'm wondering if you could give us a summary of where we are on electrifying public transportation in Massachusetts, because lots of the questions that came in through registration were asking about buses and commuter rail and all that.
I'm trying to figure out a quick way to summarize everything that's happening on electrification of public transit. Let me start with how many electric buses we currently have in the state. So we've got around 26 electric buses in operation in different parts of the state, 5 at MBTA, and the rest essentially at Worcester, Pioneer Valley, and Martha's Vineyard. So 26 is a really, really small number, considering the governor's Commission on the Future of Transportation report recommended that all the vehicles, especially those procured using state resources, including buses, transit buses, as well as state fleets, should be electric by 2030. So that's the goal. That's the recommended target that we want to reach. Currently, 26 is nowhere close to that number. At the same time, I would say that there is a lot of interest from transit agencies. And I say that because every year there is a federal grant that's available called the Low No Grant. It's a competitive grant that transit agencies can apply for. In 2016, the amount of grant available through that program was 55 million. Today, in 2020, it was 130 million. So you can just see the increase in interest, not only in Massachusetts, but across the state, across the country. And because it's a competitive grant, the demand is much more than supply. So there's a lot more that both transit agencies, the state, as well as the legislature needs to do to kind of help this transition along. And I can go a little bit more into, what that would include. For example, if you're looking at Kevin just spoke about, for example, utility reform and what needs to be done. And Dan mentioned a number of programs across different vehicle sectors, like medium and heavy duty, light duty, and the range of policies and incentives that need to be in place to address all these different categories would vary slightly. So if you're looking at public transit, you definitely need to, identify additional funding sources to meet the incremental cost of buying an electric bus. You can also look at other options like bulk procurement, where transit agencies, they have an annual rate of replacement of buses every year, and they can all get together and figure out, okay, we need 50 buses this year, and so that you can drive down costs, so doing bulk purchases. And you can have a range of incentives that maybe low financing options. Money is really cheap now in terms of interest rates. So this is something that can be explored when it comes to public transit. And I think public transit is a very, very good starting point, public transit and state fleets, because it not only, the state is not only leading by example, it also sends a price signal to manufacturers that there is interest and they need to be, ramping up on their production. Currently, there is a bit of a wait when it comes to, electric buses. Transit agencies need to really plan. I think the other piece in term, one is the incentive and the policy piece, and the other piece is what transit agencies themselves need to be doing. I think as a first step, making a commitment to electrification is very important in setting that timeline. Without that timeline, transit agencies will not allocate the resources that are required for people to plan to move towards that goal. Electrification of a transit fleet, whether it's a 50 bus fleet or 1,000 plus bus fleet like MBTA, requires a lot of planning over a number of years. You need to start immediately, but you need sustained and incremental kind of progress over a decade or over 2 decades. And that's only possible if you commit to electrification and you start planning towards it. So, so there's a lot, in short, there are a lot of pieces and to this puzzle, and we need to get moving on all of them simultaneously.
Could you speak briefly to the recent pilot that the MBTA did with some electric buses and some upcoming plans for a new bus garage?
Sure. MBTA actually got grants through the NOLO grant that I mentioned in 2014, but it was only in 2019 that they actually got 5 buses from New Flyer. They're the 60 feet buses that currently operate on the Silver Line route. What MBTA suggested when they started with the pilot is that they wanted to kind of look at the data from this pilot before they decide on any future procurements. As you know, they've not really had a chance to operate the buses as much because of COVID, but they did find that there was, in terms of the routes that the bus could cover, it didn't meet the expectation that MBTA had. They shared that the buses took a little longer to charge and did not meet the long route requirements of the Silver Line, which is around 170 miles a day. I definitely don't see this as something that disqualifies electric bus technology. I definitely see that as a sign that more needs to be done. And there is electric bus technology available today that meets a number of route requirements. So starting from, I think most buses that are available in the market today can go anywhere between 100 to 130 miles at a minimum. And then you have anywhere between 250 to 300 miles at the other end of the spectrum. So you have the technology available today, and you can start operating buses on shorter routes, electric buses on shorter routes, and then expand to routes that are more demanding. I also want to cover briefly how electrification and facilities are closely interrelated. So when you're talking about electrification of fleet, you have to ensure that the garages are, well equipped to manage charging of the fleet. Currently, all 10 of MBTA's garages are obsolete in terms of design, in terms of even managing their current bus capacity. MBTA is currently now looking at building a new facility at Quincy. It's undergoing the MIPA process, and if this is an area of interest, and if you're in the Quincy area, it's still open for public comment. So please do consider writing in and asking for two things. One is while MBTA has committed that at some point in the future, the Quincy garage will be used for electric buses, they're not considering this as an electric bus facility from day one. I think it's very possible to have an electric bus facility at the Quincy garage from day one, because it's going to be completed in 2024. So you have a 4-year period where you can not only procure buses, but you will be able to get at least a small fleet of buses ready to move into the garage in 2024 and ready to operate on routes that start out of Quincy. And a lot of those routes travel in communities that already have very high air pollution levels. So I think it's really perfect, and that's something that people should stress on, that the Quincy garage is electric from day one, and you have MBTA does whatever is required to procure at least an additional fleet of 15 to 20 buses to try out from the Quincy garage.
Thank you for that comprehensive review of public transit electrification. So we are almost at the halfway mark, so I'm going to ask one more sort of big picture question, but first I'm going to shut up and let Dan comment on what Venus is doing.
Yeah,
no, go ahead, Dan.
Well, let me just say a couple of really quick points on that, and thanks for a great overview. And I think Mass CEC has been very involved in the Quincy Garage project to get that make-ready capacity, which I understand wanting it electric from day one, but at the very least, we are going to make sure that new bus facilities like the Quincy Garage are prepared to be able to handle electric buses. And I think there's no question in the conversations that I've had with MassDOT that this is an area that's going to need a lot more resources. When you think about what it takes to either electrify an existing facility or to site and new facilities, I mean the amount of infrastructure that's going to be required for these facilities is quite a bit, and it's going to be quite expensive. And this is obviously just one of many funding needs. That's part of the reason that this administration is pursuing a dedicated source of funding for clean transportation investments through the Transportation and Climate Initiative. We really see that as a really critical piece to be able to help us make the investments that we need to be able to electrify our public transit systems, to be able to provide a sustainable source of funding for our electric vehicle incentive programs. And because I think there is a recognition, if we're going to be able to do this at scale, we're going to need to be able to find more sources of funding.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I'll be quick this time. It's great to hear about the opportunities for the state to lead by example. I think one of the ways to do it is to avoid costs that you won't have to make in the future. So hearing about having the facilities for the Quincy depot be prepared from day one for the installation of charging stations, that's half the battle, right? If you're able to make sure that all parking facilities have that capacity, you've reduced at least, if not more than half of all upfront installation costs for infrastructure. So that's something that can be looked at across the board, right? The Senate had a climate bill that moved earlier this session that would have required the Board of Building Regulations and Standards that establishes the minimum criteria for what goes into new construction, would have required them to include EV readiness, right? So those types of things are invaluable, and just make sure you look at what are we already doing right now. right? We don't have to create a brand new program. Just think about what we're already doing and how can we make sure that aligns with clean transportation needs, right? Look at what the Commonwealth's doing for the capital investments it makes every year, $10 million for state police fleet vehicles. What are the other types of capital investments we're making in our fleets? How do we start to align those types of things with investments that are gonna have net economic benefits and net societal benefits, right, from reducing transportation emissions? So just thinking about that future-proofing piece is really important, but really appreciate all the focus that Vina had on the transit piece. It's one of the most important things that we can be focusing on.
You have both excellently teed me up into the question that I wanted to ask next, which is, we hear a lot about the upfront costs, the higher upfront costs at the moment of adopting this technology because battery prices are still coming down. But one thing I want to center in this conversation is the benefits, and that those have real value as well. And talk a little bit about equity, which is something that I think is in this conversation a lot, and I want to make sure that it's explicitly in this conversation as well. So one thing I wanted to highlight first is that the American Lung Association recently published a report that talked about the public health benefits of electrifying transportation, looking at the grid, the electric grid as it is now, but also as the grid gets cleaner, how do those public health benefits stack up as we electrify transportation? And the benefits are on the order of billions of dollars per year. But one thing I want to acknowledge is that right now the harm caused by our transportation system is not felt equally, thanks to decades of intentional planning that has isolated some neighborhoods largely along racial or economic lines without access to good, clean transportation, and therefore with most of the burden from the emissions from that transportation. So if you could each briefly touch on how you think about equity along these lines in the transportation electrification conversation, which is a lot of syllables, but whoever wants to go first, take it. I know we've talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to give us a chance to sort of point to it specifically.
I can definitely take a crack at it. So we all know that transportation related air pollution disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities. And when we are looking at transportation and electrification across the sector, I think it's really important that we focus on vehicle categories that currently are responsible for most of the pollution, like medium and heavy duty vehicles, like transit buses, like delivery trucks that Dan mentioned. You're looking at those vehicle categories first and seeing what you can do to electrify those faster. That's one piece. The other thing is I keep coming back to the right policies and incentives, and I think that helps to kind of accelerate the adoption of these technologies faster. So having the right kind of policies and incentives for low-income residents and moderate-income residents. So it can be a higher incentive for them, or maybe you get an incentive based on the fact that you live in a community where the air pollution rates are higher. So you can structure the incentives in different ways. Another aspect is not only looking at cars and transit buses, but also looking at micromobility options and making those easily accessible. You have e-bikes and e-scooters, and they can easily be used for trips around the neighborhood, or for last mile and first mile, as last mile and first mile solutions. And by that way, you're reducing a large number of car trips that people would have traditionally done. And the third point, finally, is to kind of remember that transportation does not look the same across the state. It looks different in Eastern Massachusetts as compared to Western Massachusetts, or maybe rural parts of the state where you don't have easy access to transit. So maybe the solutions there could look different. It could look like EV ride sharing, or it could look you could look at shuttle buses to meet the needs of consumers in those parts of the state. So I think the solutions need to be tailored to specific needs of communities, and that will look different, and that will ensure that it's equitable and reaches a larger cross section of people.
Great. Yeah, let me jump in. I think we're looking at I think most of the things that Veena just mentioned. So for sure, thinking about structuring our incentives to provide some kind of additional incentive for vehicles operating in environmental justice communities. Obviously, you know, we're getting towards codification of our definition of environmental justice community, which is, I think, helpful in terms of getting us to think about it. And I think a lot about how we operationalize that commitment, right? Which isn't obvious at always, but but certainly one thing that we're definitely looking at is that additional incentive. We're also looking at e-bikes because we certainly see that as an interesting possibility. It's a big part of our motivation of looking at the delivery truck space, and frankly, the whole freight ecosystem, from our, you know, ports, highways, everything, all disproportionately impacts communities of color. So, you know, we're thinking pretty carefully about that as well. You know, I think we're looking to use to make some kind of commitment to a certain amount of funding going to specifically environmental justice communities. I don't want to preempt internal conversations, but those are an important component of not just our deliberations about the Transportation and Climate Initiative, but throughout state policy. And I guess one last thing I'll say is, you know, I think we do need to think about sort of a couple of different categories of sort of equity concern, right? So I think one very, very important equity concern is about environmental justice communities, people who are disproportionately exposed to pollution. And I think a lot of what we're thinking about in that is like, yeah, the medium and heavy duty, what are the high emitting vehicles, et cetera. I think we also then want to be thinking about, you know, how do we make electric vehicle technology more accessible, you know, not just to the poor, but frankly to a lot of middle class people as well. So, you know, I think that's a separate kind of way that we're thinking about equity, but I think that's also important. And I think a third category has to do with rural communities in Massachusetts, places where you don't really have transit as a viable option, you know, and how are we thinking about getting electrification to work in those communities? I think, you know, we're going to want to be self-conscious about that as well.
Thank you, Dan. Kevin, do you want to comment?
Wow, how to build upon a foundation that already has like 90 floors on it. You know, you start to become structurally unsound. How much more am I going to add to the top before we topple over? So I'd say that when ChargePoint gets involved either in regulatory or legislative issues or a high-level policy front, when we think about equity, I try and frame it in terms of equitable, fair access to the clean transportation itself, as well as equitable access to the benefits that result from it. So you want to make sure that no matter what, we're not just focusing on one sector. So we're not just saying we need publicly accessible charging stations, so everything the Commonwealth's going to do is towards that. That is definitely a part of it, but for folks who don't have vehicles, for folks you know, in other situations, we want to make sure that we're hitting all those sectors writ large. In terms of making sure that we have equitable access to all the benefits, you know, we talked a little bit about the health benefits. How do we also make sure that there's going to be a net positive impact to the grid as a result of more EVs on the road? You know, that's got to be key also. This has to make sense economically, right? In the same way that for a fleet operator, they're not going to be able to electrify their fleet if they can't afford the electricity rates. Massachusetts as a whole isn't going to be able to afford electric vehicles if we don't make sure that we're planning for it to take place in a smart, efficient, effective way. So everything that ChargePoint makes is smart and networked and capable of being managed. It's possible to ensure that we have the right policies in place to create net grid benefits. And we just have to make sure that we're supporting the utilities to put them in a position where they can manage that load effectively, and people can still use the vehicles, or they can still get on the electric bus and get to where they need to go. But getting the right frameworks in place first is really critical. I won't reiterate my points about demand charges, but I will say that, you know, getting those pieces right up front is necessary to get to that place of equity, right? Otherwise, there will be societal subsidizations, right? So let's get the foundations right first, and it's just really exciting that we've got the attention and the capability to make some of those decisions right now in Massachusetts.
Let me just build just really quickly on that point. You know, I think the potential benefits to ratepayers here are large. The study that I worked on at UCS estimated them at, you know, at a pretty significant number in terms of the potential savings for ratepayers, and thinking about what kind of investments are fair and right to ask ratepayers to make in this technology. You know, that needs to be a consideration made with an eye towards the potential for long-term ratepayer benefits, because, you know, a grid that is managed where electric vehicles are you know, mostly charging overnight and taking advantage of spare grid capacity, that's actually a really good outcome for ratepayers. And you know, we got to be really clear on being able to get those benefits and help make the case for some ratepayer investments.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Veena, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to add another point, you know, from the equity perspective. When we talk about electrification of transit buses, we are often asked the question that, you know, electric buses are so much more expensive than a diesel hybrid bus or, you know, a diesel bus. And people often feel that the time is not right to invest in electric buses. And I just want to, you know, bring out the point that we need to look at electrification as something that even though the first time costs are a little higher, the public benefits over the lifetime of the bus. Each bus travels on the road for at least a minimum of 12 years. So the faster you get that conversion to happen, cleaner the air is going to be, you lower the emissions. And these are all going to take us towards not only meeting our climate goals, but having you know, cleaner air. And as Anna mentioned, you know, the American Lung Association report that spoke about the benefits to public health kind of extend in billions of dollars when you look at it from a long-term perspective. And in addition, I think electrification leads to substantial savings for transit agencies or for an EV car driver when you're looking at maintenance and fuel costs. And EVs are definitely much more fuel efficient than their fossil fuel counterparts. So I think that also is a piece when you look at it from the equity perspective. It's important to do this soon.
Thank you for that addition. I see that we're almost at the end here, so I will, for the penultimate question, sort of bundle together a bunch of the questions that I've seen from the audience, which is from the perspective of a municipality that wants to get out ahead or keep pace or lead the way. It's really hard right now to figure out how to plan for this transition. So I'm wondering if you could speak to two parts of that. So one is the infrastructure part. What role should municipalities be playing in figuring out where to put charging stations, how much they should cost, how to organize that? And then secondly, we have one specific municipality that's saying that they were considering replacing a 20-year-old street sweeper, challenging word, but that the electric options are several $100,000 more expensive. And the question, which is probably directed at Dan, is how quickly might funding be coming down the line? So from the perspective of the municipalities, how do we do the infrastructure thing, and how quickly is help coming?
Well, it's funny. You're making me think. Do I know anything about electric street sweeper technology? And I have to admit, that's a vehicle modality I haven't specifically thought about yet. The program that, so I'm somewhat stuck not being able to we'll have more specifics to announce in terms of timeline at the next ZEP Commission meeting, which is on October 13th, and I'm going to welcome anybody who wants to attend that. I can't necessarily preempt the things that we're going to say right then, but when we think about a medium heavy duty rebate, we're thinking about a rebate that's going to apply to all vehicle classes in the medium heavy duty space. I think we are also, I will say personally, the Greenworks proposal that was moving through the legislature seemed like it would have been able to provide a nice, pretty significant chunk of funding for capital projects for municipalities, I think that there's still more opportunities for us to think about how we can direct more funding that way. Certainly, the Green Communities Act is going to be one vehicle that I think we're still going to be thinking about trying to expand as we think about getting more munis involved. But thank you for your interest, and happy to follow up with a more specific question.
Thank you. Sounds like stay tuned to next week, optimistically. Vina or Kevin, do you want to comment on the infrastructure piece?
I'd quickly just suggest that on the infrastructure side, it's great to hear that the question incorporated that. Sometimes when munis, counties, other entities are thinking about electrifying some of their vehicle fleets, the infrastructure is an afterthought, and that's almost the opposite of what you want to do. You don't want to just say, we're going to get an electric vehicle, so we need a charger. There isn't just a one-to-one. Being able to work through with folks and see what's the least amount of infrastructure footprint I need, right, to support today's vehicle needs, and then what do I need to think about for my transition plan over the coming years? What's a sort of scalable approach? So always thinking infrastructure first is important, or at the very least, simultaneous consideration. There are some pieces that I think are also within certain municipalities' realm of control, right? So if you're a muni that has its own electric light district, right? So you have some more flexibility there to think about, well, what could we be doing to incentivize and encourage other members of the community to go electric, and how do we align some of the potential incentives that are right there on the cusp? A lot of Main Street businesses are interested in creating amenities that bring folks in to their locations. The business case for EV charging isn't the sale of electrons. It's boosting what you already do. It's providing an amenity. So, like, where are the ways that we can see overlaps between things in the community that might investments in the community that might otherwise happen? So, from looking at the fleet perspective, ensuring that you've got an eye on the infrastructure, aligning incentives within your community, and then municipalities perfectly have the capability in many cases of looking at their building and construction code requirements. What are the ways that we can ensure that as construction takes place, it's future-proofed? How do we reduce the cost for what we were going to do anyway to better prepare ourselves moving forward? So those are three things that I'd suggest, and happy to take more discussions offline with specifics in mind.
Thank you.
I'd quickly add to the infrastructure piece that both Kevin and Dan kind of mentioned. And when you're talking about infrastructure, and if you're a community that has decided that over the next couple of decades you want to kind of transition all your electric fleets to electric, it would be interesting to kind of see who are the other players in your community. Are there other transportation network communities? Are there other fleet operators in your community that you could partner with and set up, for example, a charging hub where all of you could kind of use that together? And that might be pretty long term, but in the short term, you could also look at for funding options. Green Communities does offer grants for municipalities to procure electric vehicles, and maybe that's something that municipalities could consider. I also wanted to put in a plug for Sierra Club's recently released EV policy toolkit, and it has got a number of great ideas that not only municipalities but utilities, state and local governments can put in place to increase the adoption of EVs across the board. So I think either Anna could put that link in the chat. I think it's already there, and we can definitely circulate that. And please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
We will circulate that in a follow-up email. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I see we have 2 minutes left, so I would like to thank you all participants for joining and extend a hearty thank you to our panelists for being generous with your time to spend this hour with us. To close us out, could everybody give me one thing that participants can do in the next 6 months on transportation electrification? I know we've covered many, but just one to leave people with before we close out for today. Dan, you first.
So I think that the Transportation and Climate Initiative is going to be continuing to receive comment about the proposed regional program that would potentially provide hundreds of millions of dollars to help us be able to address these priorities. I think it would be great to have people weigh in with your thoughts, weigh in with your vision for how we can use this to best address transportation emissions and be able to best help disadvantaged communities. Would be great to get even more public input. I think about 10,000 people, they're saying, have already weighed in either themselves or through petitions, and the more public input we get, the better the program we can pursue.
Great. Kevin, one thing.
Most important thing that everyone on here can do is when you get a follow-up email, I will provide Anna with the names of the members of the Transportation Bond Bill Conference Committee, asking them to maintain language to look at electricity rates is the one single most important thing you can do to ensure that medium and heavy duty vehicle fleets, both public and private, as well as light duty vehicle fleets, can go electric. And that'll make sure that you as EV drivers can find, as you need it along highway corridors, more DC fast charging. Without it, it's an unmitigated, insane barrier to the market. We need to move past it, and that's the way that you can help us do it.
Okay, and Veena, one thing.
As Kevin has already covered the transportation bond bill, I think I need to cover the climate bill. So please do reach out to members of the conference committee who are working on the climate bill. And there was a lot of EV legislation this session. None of them passed. So a good idea would be to write to members of the conference committee and ask that in their final provision of the bill, they should include that MBTA transitions to 100% electric fleet by 2024, and that all state fleet procurements are electric starting 2024. I'm sorry, I got the first date wrong. So MBTA is by 2040 and state electric fleets by 2024. So please ask for that. And I'd like to add a short, another opportunity for advocacy. If you're a transit advocate, please consider showing up at MBTA board meetings. They happen twice a month on a Monday, and you can find more information at MBTA/events. The next board meeting is coming up this coming Monday on October 5th. And you'll have an opportunity to comment on the Quincy Garage and electrification as well.
Cool. Thank you again all for joining us. This webinar is recorded, and we'll be sending out a recording of it next week when National Drive Electric Week is closed out. But for now, I hope you all have a lovely rest of your afternoon, and thanks again for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.